On the night of January 3rd this year, the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, was shaken by explosions, gunfire, and the noise of military equipment. It seemed that a war had begun, the possibility of which had been discussed back in August 2025. The invasion of American troops to overthrow the local dictator, Nicolas Maduro, however, in reality, the invasion lasted less than an hour. The Americans captured Maduro and took him to the United States, where he soon appeared before a New York court. And the whole world literally stood still with their mouths open, silently asking, what was that anyway? Today we'll discuss whether anything has changed in Venezuela after the abduction of its president, and if so, what exactly has changed. In short, we'll go into detail about Venezuela, Trump, and how all of this could affect the global economy, and even the current Russian-Ukrainian war. My name is Semyon. The Mega Shot television channel provides the most objective and balanced analytical content, and we mentally move forward. Briefly about the main points. First, I want to remind our subscribers and viewers that our channel has a separate episode specifically dedicated to the possibility of an American invasion of Venezuela and, in general, the nature of the long-standing hostility between the United States and Venezuela. If you haven't watched it, be sure to check it out. It's kind of a prologue to the backstory, which is extremely necessary for understanding the current events. So let's take the bull by the horns and get right into it. So, it's the middle of the night between January 2nd and 3rd in Venezuela. In the evening, President Nicolas Maduro received the Chinese Special Representative Chu Xiaoqi and looked very confident. And in general, throughout the previous months, the Venezuelan dictator often behaved provocatively, practically ignoring the threat posed by the huge American fleet concentrated in the southern part of the Caribbean Sea. As it turned out later, the last straw for Trump's patience was Maduro's public dancing, which the White House saw as mocking Washington's demands, making it impossible to have any constructive negotiations with Maduro. And right after the Christmas and New Year holidays, a strike was launched called Operation Absolute Resolve. First, missiles were launched at military bases, ports, and several government buildings. And after panic swept through Caracas, American helicopters freely flew to Maduro's residence, from which a group of special forces landed. They quickly captured Maduro. Together with his wife, Celia Flores Trenicky, they were taken to the United States, and 2 days later, they were brought to the Federal District Court of the Southern District of New York. There, the former president and his wife were charged with organizing and protecting drug trafficking, and most importantly, exporting cocaine to the United States. In fact, the prosecution claims that under Maduro, the Venezuelan state apparatus was turned into one huge corruption network serving the interests of the global drug trade. According to experts in American law, this high-profile trial will last at least 3 to 4 years and could even end with a death sentence. However, considering the specifics of New York State's judicial practice, most likely, Maduro will simply spend the rest of his days behind bars. American justice rarely lets anyone escape from its clutches. The former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Lazarenko, who broke through, can definitely confirm what it was really like. I won't focus on the fate of the poor and unfortunate overthrown dictator, but will instead draw your attention to the future of Venezuela. But before that, a few words about the events that took place. If you watched my previous video, you should definitely remember my prediction for the near future. The United States will only start an invasion if they are completely sure that the war will be swift and with minimal losses, especially among the personnel, a sort of American-style Blitzkrieg. And this assumption came true almost 100%. The Americans played everything out just like sheet music. According to official data, not a single United States serviceman died during Operation Absolute Resolve, although 7 people were seriously wounded. This fact testified to the high level of awareness of the American strategists responsible for preparing this operation, as well as to the even higher level of training of the American Special Forces. Naturally, this gave rise to a huge number of theories about the existence of many CIA agents within the security service, as well as among the Venezuelan generals, who were actually able to make the kidnapping of the dictator so smooth and painless, combined with the obvious incompetence of the Venezuelan military. It should also be noted that the complete absence of casualties among the American soldiers is explained by the Americans' use of some top-secret experimental sonic weapon, which caused Maduro's guards to experience panic attacks and terrible headaches. Trump called it the discombobulator, and this is how one of Maduro's bodyguards described its effects. At some point, they activated something. I don't know how to describe it. It was like a very powerful sound wave. Suddenly, I felt like my head was exploding from the inside. The effects were immediate and terrifying. Blood started coming out of our noses. Some people were vomiting blood. We fell to the ground, unable to move. We couldn't even get up after they used that sonic weapon, or whatever it was. Besides, it's important to note that the Venezuelan air defense, which is equipped with pretty decent Russian and Chinese systems, wasn't able to shoot down a single enemy aircraft. The Americans immediately blinded the Venezuelan units by completely disabling their radar systems and also suppressed resistance strongholds and firing points using drones. As the Venezuelan military later recalled, we were on alert, but suddenly all our radar systems shut down without any explanation. The next thing we saw was drones, lots of drones flying over our positions. We didn't know how to respond. In any case, we are dealing with a Blitzkrieg, but without a full-scale ground invasion. And to be more precise, this is exactly a real special military operation. Yes, you heard right. The capture of Maduro is exactly a special military operation in its purest form, and not at all what Putin was talking about on February 24, 2022. If we analyze historical experience, the most similar event in essence would be the storming of Amin's palace in December 1979, which actually led to the beginning of the well-known Afghan war. The same time limitation, not even measured in hours but in mere minutes, precision in execution, high coordination between different units, and clear technological superiority. Only in that case, the overthrow of the head of Afghanistan led to a complete change of the ruling regime and the start of a full-scale war, while in the case of Venezuela, this did not happen, at least in my opinion. So, what exactly is the distinguishing feature of Trump's special military operation? On the Venezuelan front, nothing has changed so far. First of all, it should be noted that in the past, the United States has also repeatedly overthrown rulers they didn't like. The most recent example is the war in Iraq in 2003, which ended with the fall of the hated regime of Saddam Hussein. However, the Americans never left the situation unattended and immediately replaced the government with one loyal to themselves. But here, American helicopters flew away with their spoils on board. After that, they didn't care what happened next. The problem is that power in post-Maduro Venezuela did not go to the liberal democratic opposition, as many had expected. No, the same people remained in power, the very embodiment of the existing system. The official head of state became Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who has been a longtime ally of Maduro. However, she still refers to herself not as a full-fledged president, but merely as an acting president, thus emphasizing the temporary nature of her position, as well as the possibility that Maduro may soon return to power, which of course is impossible in practice. Although most likely, this option was chosen in order to avoid holding presidential elections, which, according to the current constitution, must be held within the next 30 days. Apparently, Maduro's successors understand their extreme unpopularity among the general public and are seriously afraid of losing if free elections are held. Especially right after Maduro flew away in a blue helicopter. A state of emergency was declared throughout Venezuela, which significantly gave more freedom to the security forces. Rodriguez and his team are not fighters against popular unrest or even armed rebellions, so they are trying to act preemptively and stay in power. By the way, Rodriguez's team is quite remarkable and speaks for itself. Her brother, José Jesus Rodríguez Gómez, holds the next most important position in the country as the chairman of the National Assembly, that is, the Speaker of Parliament. In our terms, that's a plus. During the state of emergency, security forces gained more influence. Among them, a special place is held by the Minister of Internal Affairs, Diosdado Cabello, and the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino López. By the way, the last character was named Vladimir, not in honor of the future gatherer of Russian lands. At that time, he was still running barefoot through the back streets of St. Petersburg. Of course, this Lopez was named Vladimir in honor of Lenin, which indirectly confirms the popularity of leftist ideas and their leaders among ordinary Latin Americans. In short, this whole gang is openly anti-American in their views and continues to remain loyal to the ideas of the late Hugo Chavez and the ousted Maduro. Everything happening in Venezuela sharply contrasts with Trump's statements that he achieved the greatest victory, and a bloodless one at that. After all, there is still no answer to the main question: will the abduction of Maduro lead to the very changes in Venezuela that the Americans are insisting on? The answer to that question decides if this entire operation can be considered successful. Or was it just a one-time public relations stunt by Trump, which resulted in replacing one anti-American leader of Venezuela with another from the same ideological group? Possibly even a more competent one, which means more dangerous than the previous one. That's why, during the first week of January, there was a reasonable theory circulating in the international community that everything happening was the result of a deal between Trump and Maduro's inner circle, who themselves were interested in getting rid of their failed boss. In fact, it was thanks to this collusion that his abduction became possible. This theory is also supported by Trump's statements that, supposedly, the leader of the Venezuelan opposition, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Machado, is not suitable for the role of the country's leader. From this, it could be concluded that Washington de facto recognizes the legitimate authority of acting President Rodriguez and intends to cooperate with her in the future. Moreover, there is not the slightest indication that the government in Caracas is collapsing and transferring power to the pro-American democratic opposition. And where are we in all of this? Trump has never hidden that the fundamental interest of the United States in Venezuela is its oil. Accusing Maduro of drug trafficking is nothing more than a convenient cover. In fact, he confirmed this right after the successful abduction, stating that the main goal of this entire operation is to gain control over power in Venezuela and its oil. While Trump is still struggling to gain control over the new authorities, even more questions arise regarding the oil. Moreover, the oil factor will be the answer to the key question of this video: has Venezuela changed after Maduro? However, let's take it step by step. First, let me remind you that Venezuela is the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and up until the beginning of the 21st century, almost all Venezuelan oil production belonged to American companies. However, the rise to power of the radical socialist Hugo Chavez in 1999 changed everything. The oil was taken from its owners and nationalized. American entrepreneurs, who had invested millions at the time, of course, were not compensated a single cent. And now, kindly Grandpa Trump intends to correct this blatant injustice. But is that really the case? A week after Maduro's takeover, the American president gathered the heads of the largest oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, Conoco, Phillips, Chevron, Halliburton, and others, at the White House. Trump stated that now is the time for American business to return to Venezuela and called for direct investments of no less than $100 billion. At the same time, he said that in addition to the huge profits investors would receive, the United States would also seize the lead in this way, in controlling the global oil sales market and, most importantly, control over pricing. That is, if the Americans enter the Venezuelan market and take control of local oil production, they will lift all previously imposed sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports, which means they will be able to flood the world with a large amount of oil. So, in 2025, Venezuela produced on average just over 1 million barrels per day, which accounted for less than 1% of global production. But back in 1997, when Venezuela was the main supplier of raw materials for American refineries in Texas and Louisiana, daily production ranged around 3.5 million barrels, which accounted for more than 5% of the global market. So, theoretically, if the United States regains control over Venezuelan oil, they could flood the market with a colossal amount of black gold, and if not completely crash global prices, at least significantly lower them. And this, in turn, would sharply reduce the flow of petrodollars, which essentially sustains the economy of Putin's Russia. Remember how the late John McCain once called Russia a giant gas station pretending to be a country? This wasn't just said for effect. Now let me give you some numbers. According to many experts, today Russia needs stable prices in the range of $70 to $80 per barrel to finance the ongoing war with Ukraine and at the same time maintain internal social stability. At lower prices, oil and gas revenues fall, and Moscow has to cover the budget deficit using previously accumulated gold and foreign currency reserves or external borrowing. If the figures drop to $50, Russia will have to seriously tighten its belt and choose, so to speak, between guns and butter. And a price of $40 per barrel can be called the point of no return, after which the entire Russian pseudo-economy will collapse into oblivion even worse than the Soviet one. By the way, in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan managed to bring prices down from $30 to $35 to $10 to $12 per barrel by flooding the market with large volumes of Arab oil. What did it cost the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? You know just as well as I do. And I also recommend everyone to read Yegor Gaidar's monograph, The Collapse of an Empire, which describes the downfall of the once mighty Soviet Union. He explained it purely by economic factors, specifically the oil price boom, and not by conspiracy theories in Putin's style, or the machinations of damned imperialists and cunning Democrats. Golden oil, therefore, turns out to be quite a logical and workable scheme. The United States gets access to Venezuelan oil, its production increases, its exports grow, global oil prices go down, Russia's revenues decrease, Putin becomes more accommodating and agrees to freeze the war. It's a beautiful scheme, a fair one. However, as is often the case, theoretical calculations don't always match real-life realities, and this scheme, despite its apparent simplicity, has its weak points. And in this case, there are two of them. First of all, there's nothing to indicate that the new, but still old, Venezuelan authorities are going to let Americans into their market. Contrary to Trump's statements, all oil production continues to be concentrated in the hands of the huge state conglomerate Petróleos de Venezuela, Sociedad Anónima. Maduro's successors show not the slightest desire to start even a partial privatization of oil production, let alone compensate for all the losses that the Venezuelan authorities caused American energy companies 25 years ago by nationalizing their property. American oil companies, meanwhile, are reluctant to invest in countries controlled by anti-American forces and with highly unstable legal systems. At the same meeting in the White House, ExxonMobil Chief Executive Officer Darren Woods directly disagreed with Trump, calling Venezuela a country completely unsuitable for investment. And that's not surprising at all. Who in their right mind would risk investing serious money in a place where that money can be brazenly seized at any moment without a second thought? Big American business doesn't trust Rodriguez and all her brothers, doesn't believe in real change in Venezuela, and they're right to do so. The second weak point of the network structure is the technical aspect, or more precisely, as I already mentioned, the extremely unusual characteristics of Venezuelan oil. The overwhelming majority of black gold is located in the Orinoco River basin. The peculiarity of these deposits is that they are rich in so-called heavy and extra-heavy oil. Unlike light Arabian oil, the density of Venezuelan oil is very high. In terms of its consistency, it is more like bitumen or fuel oil, and it also contains a lot of sulfur, which requires additional refining. And, as strange as it may sound, this oil is even heavier than water. Because of its very high viscosity, Venezuelan oil is extremely difficult to bring to the surface. To do this, various unusual extraction methods are used, such as injecting hot steam into the oil reservoir, which liquefies the oil and pushes it out. But even after being extracted from the ground, this oil is still quite difficult to work with. It's too thick and viscous to be transported through regular pipelines or processed with standard refinery equipment. Further processing requires the so-called upgrading procedure, a complex chemical and physical process that includes thermal cracking, hydroprocessing, demetallization, and other operations that are far from cheap. Naturally, the United States has technologies capable of working with such heavy oil, and they were installed at Venezuelan refineries. They belong to American corporations. But when Hugo Chavez took everything under his control, the new state owners ruined all these technologies over the next 25 years. This once again confirms the simple truth of market economics. If an enterprise is privately owned, it develops because the owner needs to make a profit. But if the enterprise is state-owned, you shouldn't expect any profit. Because an official running such an enterprise is more likely to be interested in stealing something for himself, rather than thinking about profitability and modernization. Just remember the Soviet experience. Shortages due to bureaucracy and inevitable bribery. This is the curse of socialism, no matter how attractive it may seem to the masses. In short, over the past years, the equipment quickly wore out, and it was impossible to replace it because of the sanctions. That's why in recent years, Venezuela hasn't processed oil at all, but has been selling it raw to China. The primitive raw material nature of the economy once again highlighted the depths to which socialist Venezuela had sunk. Of course, not without the help of Chavez, Maduro, and others like them. To sum up, even if American capital is allowed into the Venezuelan economy, it will have to work very hard, and it's foolish. They'll have to spend so much to restore the oil infrastructure that was destroyed over a quarter of a century. It's no wonder Trump talked about the need to invest at least $100 billion. But besides the fact that this is extremely costly and very risky, the main problem is time. After all this restoration will take far more than just 1 year. So, according to the most preliminary estimates by the independent consulting company Rested Energy, returning to the level of 2 million barrels per day may not be possible before 2032. And reaching the levels of the 1990s won't be possible before 2040. With total investments of at least $183 billion, that's an extremely distant planning horizon, and American oil companies might not dare to take such a step in our unpredictable times. And most importantly, it's not entirely clear how, even under the most favorable conditions, the market could be quickly flooded with Venezuelan oil. Even if Trump manages to persuade the Venezuelan authorities and convince American oilmen to invest in Venezuelan production, he definitely won't be able to talk them into selling significant volumes of oil below cost. In any case, even in the most optimistic scenario, in the foreseeable future, global oil supply will increase due to Venezuelan production by no more than 1 to 2%, which is unlikely to lead to a sharp collapse in prices on the global market. Of course, it's possible that Trump is counting on the psychological effect of his statements, hoping that the mere promise of Venezuelan oil supplies will make traders lower prices in advance in the near future, and make Putin think about the long-term consequences of continuing the war. However, considering that we're talking about influencing people who understand the oil industry very well, it's far from obvious that this trick will work. So what has fundamentally changed? To be as objective as possible, there haven't been any drastic changes inside Venezuela after the overthrow of Maduro. There was only a change in the political regime's label, not its essence. The facts indicate that Trump acted in his usual manner. A flashy one-time action, a powerful public relations campaign around it, and then nothing happens, just like nothing is moving forward. For example, the implementation of Trump's peace plan for the Gaza Strip, which, I remind you, involved transferring control of the area to international forces and destroying Hamas. Hamas is still in power and Gaza is not going to disarm. And aside from the ceasefire that is occasionally violated, there are no major changes happening there. But even if we assume that someone from Maduro's inner circle did betray him, it will be extremely difficult to completely change Venezuela's policy while the army and special services are controlled by ideologically anti-American forces, especially with support from China and Russia. Just like, for example, if someone were to suddenly kidnap Putin from his bunker, but people like Patrushev, Bortnikov, Shoigu, Medvedev, and others like them remained in power. Do you think they are capable of drastically changing Russia's foreign policy, ending the war with Ukraine, and making peace with the West? Of course not. For Venezuela, the United States definitely has its own influence levers. Washington did not end the oil blockade of Venezuela and began openly hunting its tankers, which had Russian tricolors painted on them. In addition, Trump has repeatedly made it clear that Americans might even go for a full-scale invasion, but there are very serious doubts about their willingness to do so. War is extremely unpopular in the United States, even if it's a surgical one. An operation to capture Maduro that avoided American casualties still sparked protests, especially among supporters of the Democratic Party. And if the United States gets drawn into a major war with serious losses, the situation for Trump will become catastrophically worse. So, the situation is still developing, and there are many possible scenarios. Considering the chance that Trump could gain control of power and oil in Venezuela, and ending with the possibility that he will eventually get involved in a large-scale war, or simply let the situation take its own course. Having been satisfied with the public relations effect already created and the abduction, Maduro looks impressive, but in reality is not very effective. That's all from me. Thank you for watching, thanks to all the sponsors for supporting the channel, and see you in the next video. Goodbye everyone.